Welcome to the battle for Hostomel Airfield, the battle that decided the fate of Ukraine. Before we get into the battle itself, let's take a look at the Russian plan. Using dozens of helicopters based in Belarus, hundreds of crack paratroopers will be flown to the airfield to seize it and its runway. Once secure, the runway will be used to land transport planes carrying around 1,000 more soldiers from Russia itself in an operation known as an airlift. A third wave of reinforcements will then arrive overland from Belarus. This combined force will advance into the capital, kill or capture the Ukrainian government, and from there, take over the country. At least, that's the plan. This is the blow-by-blow account of the battle that saved Ukraine from immediate collapse and the tactics that ensured Ukrainian victory. This is the battle for Hostomel Airfield, and this is Battleboard. We're now looking at a close-up map of Ukraine. You can see the Belarus border and where the Dnipro River crosses it and how it flows down into the Ukrainian capital. And this is Hostomel Airfield, a large airstrip about 15 miles from the center. As the clock ticks over to 0900 hours, Putin's plan swings into action. At Bokov Airfield, a little outside the town of Mazia in Belarus, around 30 Russian helicopters get airborne. Among them are 10 K-852 attack helicopters and a handful of older Mi-24 attack helicopters, and 2 waves of Mi-8 transport planes, with 10 helicopters in each wave. On board the transports are 300 men from the 31st Guards Air Assault Brigade, otherwise known as the VDV, Russia's elite paratroopers, and the 45th Spetsnaz Brigade, the Kremlin's feared special forces. The helicopter pilots quickly navigate from Mazia to the Dnipro River and then begin to follow it south towards the Ukraine border. Kyiv has 2 large air defense sites scanning the skies north of the capital for threats. Even though Russia's missile barrage should have destroyed these sites, the helicopter pilots are taking no chances. They are flying very low, known as a nap of the earth approach, to pass underneath the Ukrainian radar. Around 9:30, they cross the border unnoticed and continue to follow the river south towards the Ukrainian capital. Emerging from the waterway, the helicopters skim the surface of the Kyiv reservoir until they get within sight of a large dam just to the north of Kyiv. At last, the Ukrainians spot them and air defenses immediately open fire, downing 1 Mi-24 and damaging a Ka-52, which crash lands. Already, it appears things are not going to plan for the Russians. Putin's security forces had assured him that the Ukrainians would not resist a Russian invasion. In fact, they would be thankful to get rid of their government and rejoin the so-called motherland. For that reason, the force on its way to Hostomel is not particularly large or well-armed. They face having to hold the airport for hours, at least, before reinforcements arrive, and even when backup gets there, they will all be surrounded. This operation was always going to be risky, but if the Ukrainians are resisting, then the odds are heavily stacked against Russia. Perhaps this occurs to some of the men on the helicopters, but they press on regardless and make a sharp westward turn away from the Ukrainian capital and towards Hostomel Airfield. At 10:30 hours, they arrive. This is Hostomel Airfield, otherwise known as Antonov Airport because the Antonov Company, a Ukrainian plane maker, has one of its 2 main bases there. It compromises 2 large hangars where the company stores some of their fleet, including the Mriya, one of the largest aircraft that ever flew. There is a radar array at the north end of the airfield, a collection of military buildings in the southeast, including a barracks, and beyond that, some residential buildings and the city itself. Then there is the all-important runway, a little over 2 miles long and made of reinforced concrete rather than tarmac to handle the Mriya's weight. The perfect spot, in other words, to land a bunch of heavy military equipment. As the Russian helicopters arrive from the east, they find the Ukrainians waiting for them. Around 200 soldiers have been on alert since 6 a.m. when 2 rockets slammed into the airfield, aiming for their barracks and administrative buildings. Both missed. Around 20 men are guarding the radar, while the rest are spread out near the hangars. These men are equipped with a Zu-232 anti-aircraft gun, while these men are armed with only rifles and Igla anti-air rocket launchers. As a precaution, they have parked vehicles all across the runway, meaning no aircraft can land until they are moved. These men are mostly from the 4th Rapid Reaction Brigade. The unit is NATO trained, but the troops at the airport at this moment are far from elite. That's because Ukraine thought Russia's initial attack would take place in the Donbass, hundreds of miles to the east, and it has moved all of its best men there. Those remaining at the airfield are largely conscripts and administrative officers who never expected to see frontline combat, though they don't know it yet. For the next 2 hours, they will be all that stands between a free and sovereign Ukraine and one under Russia's boot. At 1100 hours, the real battle begins. Russia's helicopters split into 2 groups. The attack helicopters go to the northern end of the runway to take out the anti-aircraft gun, while the transports head south to try and land their men near the barracks. The K-852s and Mi-24s open fire with their autocannons and unguided rockets, and the Ukrainians shoot back with everything at their disposal. Within a few moments, one of the Ka-52s is shot down by an anti-air rocket. It crash lands in the middle of the runway, creating another obstacle. In the ensuing battle, another 2 Ka-52s are lost, one of which crashes and explodes, and another of which crash lands intact in a field just to the north of the airstrip. An Mi-24 is blown up south of the runway, while an Mi-8 is damaged and forced to land on the airstrip, where it is later blown up. Heavy damage is caused to the airport as missiles go flying. The Maria, which was in its hangar at the time, is set on fire and burns. Fuel tanks dotted around the airstrip are also set ablaze, and the burning of crashed helicopters fills the sky with black smoke, making it even harder for Russia to land. But eventually, the Ukrainian resistance can hold out no longer. The troops are out of ammunition, and the order is given to fall back towards the barracks. With the skies now clear of rockets, the Russians begin landing troops to the west and northeast of the airfield, who quickly move out and begin to seize their targets. The soldiers guarding the radar at the northern end of the airfield are overwhelmed and surrender, becoming the first Ukrainians to be captured by Russia. As the Russians move towards the southeast corner of the airfield, a gun battle breaks out with the remaining defenders near one of the hangars. However, the Ukrainians are badly outmatched and are soon forced to withdraw into the nearby residential buildings. The Russians raise their flag over the airport barracks, and at 1300 hours, around 2 hours after the battle began, Hostomel Airfield is under their control. For the second phase of Russia's plan, we need to take a look at this map, which shows a zoomed out view of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. At Pskov Airfield, 500 miles to the north of Hostomel, 18 IL-76 transport planes get airborne, carrying an estimated 1,000 troops. It is thought these men come from the 76th Guards Air Assault Division, which is based in Pskov and is considered one of the most combat-ready units in the Russian military. Flight time from Pskov to Hostomel is about 2 hours, but the planes will never make it. Instead, about 2/3 of the way through their journey, they are forced to abandon their mission and land at an unknown location somewhere in Belarus. And that's because the Ukrainians managed to get their own reinforcements to the airfield first. This is a close-in view of the Ukrainian capital Kyiv and 2 nearby cities, Zhytomyr and Bilyserka, where Ukrainian reinforcements are positioned. Almost as soon as the battle at Hostomel started, the Ukrainians realized Russia's main invasion wasn't coming from the east, and that stopping the airlift was vital to their survival. What they needed was time to get extra men to the airport and retake it. And this is exactly what the brave 200 defenders have brought them. If those men had retreated, Ukraine may well have fallen. Instead, they held out for 2 crucial hours. In that time, Ukraine managed to move 3 brigades to the airport. The 72nd Mechanized, part of which was in Kyiv and part of which was stationed in Bilyserka, around 50 miles to the south, along with the 80th Air Assault and 95th Air Assault, which were located in Zhytomyr, around 70 miles to the west. Bit by bit, these forces arrived at Hostomel. For the airborne, their journey was relatively simple. They loaded onto helicopters and flew the short distance, much as the Russians did. But for the 72nd, with tanks and artillery guns to move, the task was harder. Luckily, Ukrainian civilians helped out, bringing commercial trucks and trailers to take the heavy armor north in a mission that the commander dubbed the March of Life. Let's take another look at this close-up map of Hostomel Airfield. As the big guns start arriving at the airfield, they open fire on the runway, cratering it so that Russian aircraft cannot land. This is what forces them to call off the airlift. The paratroopers, already at the airfield, are now stranded. They have no heavy weapons or air support to hit back at the artillery with, and venturing out into the open is a no-go. Their only hope is to hold out long enough for the ground forces advancing from Belarus to arrive, so they dig in. A little after 1500 hours, the last of the Ukrainian reinforcements arrive. At 1530, Volodymyr Zelensky announces that the airfield is totally surrounded. With the world watching, he gives the troops the order to attack and retake it. The Ukrainian airborne move in from the west, and the 72nd Mechanized move in from the east, encircling Hostomel and quickly overwhelming the Russian defenders. Artillery, now backed by Ukrainian Su-25 bombers, unleash a salvo of explosives on the runway and put it out of action for good. Ukrainian Mi-24 helicopters join the fight, providing close air support to the troops on the ground, clearing the buildings. The Russians fight back, but they cannot hold out for long. The column of reinforcements they are waiting on has snarled up somewhere south of Chernobyl as poor logistics and Ukrainian attacks take their toll. No reinforcements are coming. Hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned, the Russian paratroopers are driven off the airfield and suffer heavy casualties. Those not killed in the fighting are chased into the nearby fields and lack the strength to mount any kind of counterattack. By 2100, the airport is fully back under Ukrainian control, and the fighting has stopped. It is not until the following day that the Russian armored column arrives. Rather than defend the airfield, the Ukrainians now withdraw, but shell the airport one last time to ensure it cannot be easily repaired. Hostomel would ultimately be as close to Kyiv as Russia's troops would get. After leaving the airstrip, Ukraine set up a defensive line running through Hostomel and neighboring Bucha and Irpin, where they bogged the Russians down for weeks and inflicted heavy casualties. On April 1st, Putin's generals made the decision to withdraw from the area and all areas north of Kyiv, giving up any hope of taking the Ukrainian capital and leaving plentiful evidence of war crimes in their wake. The battle for Hostomel was won. Russia was forced to refocus its war effort on the Donbass, where Ukraine thought it would strike in the first place. Putin thought he could take the whole country in just a few days, but more than 2 years later, the fighting continues. So, why did the Russian attack fail? Let's clear the board and talk about some of the tactics involved in the battle and why the Russian plan failed. The keys to the Kremlin's plan were surprise, speed, and sequencing. First, they had to capture the airfield without the Ukrainians realizing what they were up to. Then, they had to get their planes on the ground before Kyiv could organize a defense. Finally, ground troops had to arrive at precisely the right moment so they could advance into the city and take over. Initially, the plan worked. Ukraine was not expecting an attack on the capital and did not see the helicopters cross the border. But from the moment the choppers were spotted close to Kyiv, the Ukrainians guessed exactly what they were up to and moved to thwart their plan. So how did they work it out so fast? Because this was far from the first time the Russians have used this tactic. Czechoslovakia was the first to fall victim to it back in 1968, when the Soviet Union invaded its own ally to put down a rebellion known as the Prague Spring. Months of protests had prompted liberal political reforms in the country which the Soviets could not abide. Overnight on August the 20th, they invaded, along with allies Poland, Bulgaria, and Hungary. The battle plan mirrored the Ukraine invasion almost exactly. As hundreds of thousands of troops and tanks rolled across the border and into Czechoslovakia, crack paratroopers were flown to Prague's main airport, which they quickly seized. Once the airport was taken, more troops were flown in using the runway and spread out through the capital to capture key sites like military headquarters, radio stations, and government buildings. Before they knew what was happening, the country's leaders were loaded onto planes and flown to Russia with their posts taken over by Kremlin loyalists. Ground troops then occupied the country for the next several months until all resistance had been crushed. The plan came off almost without a hitch and was repeated again during the 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Following the assassination of pro-Soviet leadership and reforms by those who took over, the USSR again invaded. Russia's airborne forces captured Kabul airport, used it to land reinforcements, took the Afghan leadership back to Russia, and then sent its army to occupy the country. That occupation ended badly, but it seems a young Vladimir Putin, then just starting out as a KGB agent, observed and remembered the invasion plan, because he would later use it himself. In 2014, during Russia's first invasion of Ukraine, Putin wheeled out the tactic to seize control of Crimea, this time targeting the main airport in Sevastopol for the airlift. Crimea was occupied almost without a shot being fired, and then later annexed in a sham referendum. The West, stunned by the audacity of the move, imposed sanctions but did little else, handing Putin a near bloodless victory. Ordinary Russians loved him for it, and his popularity soared, almost certainly inspiring him to try the same plan again a decade later, but on a countrywide scale. This meant the Ukrainians were almost certainly aware of the tactic from their own history, but even if they weren't, then their generals would have known about it from their training at Soviet military academies. Valery Zaluzhny, Ukraine's top general on the day the all-out war began, was schooled on Soviet doctrine and has gone on record saying he read every book that Valery Gerasimov, his opposite number in Moscow, ever wrote. All of which is to say, Zaluzhny and Ukraine's other generals know how the Russians think because they were trained to think the same way. So when news spread during the chaos of the first day of the invasion that helicopters had been spotted heading for Hostomel, they would have known instantly what their enemies were up to. That meant the Russians lost the element of surprise. It was then down to the discipline and bravery of Ukraine's soldiers to do the rest. The 200 men who held the airport for 2 crucial hours were responsible for robbing the Russians of speed. Had these men fled without a fight, the Russian airlift would have been completed before the Ukrainian support brigades from Bilaserka and Zhytomyr arrived, and a combination of poor Russian logistics and Ukrainian resistance north of Hostomel wrecked the sequencing. By the time the overland column of reinforcements arrived from Belarus and seized the airfield, the Ukrainians had cratered the runway and rendered it useless. And Kyiv, now aware of Russia's plan to storm the capital, was able to organize a defensive perimeter around the city that Putin's troops never managed to break. And that is why Putin's plan for victory in 3 days failed, and why Ukraine was able to maintain control of the country. Hey everyone, thanks for watching the first episode of Battleboard. If you liked it and you want more war content, stick around for a minute of our other show, War on Tape. This is an American Abrams tank being hit by a Russian drone near the city of Avdiivka back in February. And this is the very first piece of footage we've seen of one being destroyed by the Russian army. The Abrams is among the world's best, but the Ukrainians managed to lose 3 of them in a little over a week. And they have lost even more since then. Which begs the question, does the Abrams have a place on the battlefields of the future? We'll analyse this footage, delve into the history of the Abrams, and speak to an expert to find out. This is one of 31 Abrams M1A1 tanks given to the Ukrainians by the US and used to equip the 47th Brigade. The M1A1 entered service in 1986. It weighs around 60 tons, is powered by a gas turbine engine that'll run on pretty much any kind of fuel, and is armed with a 120mm main cannon. It is coated in Chobham composite armour, which provides some of the best protection in the world to the crew of 4 who sit inside the turret. At the back of the turret is an armoured compartment where the ammunition is stored, which is separated from the turret by blast doors. That means even if the ammo explodes during battle, the crew will be protected. and on top of the compartment are blowout panels, deliberately weak sections which pop off and vent the blast away from the crew. Thanks for watching. If you like this kind of content and want to see more in your feed, don't forget to hit like and subscribe, or click the buttons on screen to watch other episodes.